By the time the courtroom doors closed behind him, Judge Lawrence Sterling already knew something was wrong. Nothing had exploded. No one had shouted. There had been no objection slammed onto the record, no gavel shattering the air. On paper, it had been an ordinary morning in municipal court, the kind of docket that barely deserved a second thought. And yet, as Sterling walked down the narrow hallway, lined with framed portraits of retired judges, the silence followed him like a shadow that refused to stay behind. It clung to his shoulders. It pressed against his ears. It felt heavier than any verdict he had ever delivered. Inside the courtroom, people were still seated, though the session had ended. That alone was strange. Usually, the gallery emptied the second Sterling rose from the bench. Defendants rushed out. Lawyers packed their briefcases. Clerks shuffled papers with mechanical efficiency. Today, no one seemed eager to move. Sterling slowed his pace. He sensed it before he turned around. The shift in the air. The way conversations died mid-sentence. The way eyes, once glazed with boredom, now followed him with something sharper. Something unsettled. A laugh had echoed earlier. He remembered that much. A quick burst of amusement, harmless at the time, barely worth acknowledging. Courtrooms heard laughter all the time. Nervous laughter, relieved laughter, the kind that leaked out when tension broke. This one had sounded no different. But it hadn't finished the way laughter usually did. It hadn't faded naturally. It had stopped, cut off so abruptly, it left a hollow space behind, like a sound that should have kept ringing, but didn't. The kind of silence that made people look down at their hands, at the floor, anywhere but at each other. Sterling reached the corner near the clerk's desk. He nodded to Martha, his senior clerk, expecting the usual tight smile. She looked at him, then away, too quickly. Her fingers trembled as she stacked files that were already neatly aligned. "You all right, Judge?" he asked, his voice calm, practiced. "Yes, of course," she said. Too fast, too flat. Behind her, the court reporter sat frozen, her hands hovering above the keyboard, as if she had forgotten what to do next. She wasn't typing. She was staring at the screen, eyes wide, lips pressed together, replaying something only she could hear. Sterling adjusted his robe. This was ridiculous, he told himself. Courtrooms were emotional places. People projected their own baggage onto the bench all the time. He had seen anger, gratitude, desperation, even hatred in those pews. None of it mattered once the ruling was entered. And yet, as he stepped into the hallway, he noticed something else. The prosecutor assigned to the morning docket stood near the exit, phone clenched tightly in his hand. He wasn't scrolling. He wasn't texting. He was staring at the dark screen as if it might light up on its own and explain what had just happened. Sterling cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed," he said, "you're done for the day. You can go." The young man looked up. For a split second, his face registered something raw. Fear, maybe, or regret. Then it vanished, replaced by a polite nod. "Yes, Your Honor." But he didn't leave right away. Neither did anyone else. The hallway felt narrower now, the air thick with the scent of old paper, floor polish, and something else Sterling couldn't place. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hostility. It was worse. It was recognition. Sterling straightened his spine and continued toward his chambers. His shoes clicked against the tile, the sound too loud, too deliberate. Every step seemed to announce him in a way it never had before. Inside his office, he closed the door and leaned back against it, exhaling slowly. The room was familiar, safe. Mahogany shelves, leather chairs, diplomas framed in gold. Proof that he belonged exactly where he was. So why did his pulse refuse to slow? He glanced at the clock. Still on schedule. Lunch would not be delayed. The day had not derailed. And yet a strange thought crept in, unwelcome and persistent. Something had slipped. Not a case. Not a ruling. Something smaller, something quieter. A moment. Sterling moved to his desk and placed both hands on its polished surface. His reflection stared back at him from the glass frame of a family photo. A composed man. A respected judge. Someone who had spent decades believing that control was something you earned and then kept. But control, he was beginning to understand, did not disappear with noise. Sometimes it vanished in silence. Outside, the muffled sound of voices rose, then fell. Footsteps shuffled, hesitant, as if people were unsure which direction to go next. No one laughed now. No one lingered to chat. They left the building the way people leave a place after witnessing something they did not expect and did not want to examine too closely. Sterling loosened his tie. He told himself it was nothing. A misread mood, a long morning. He had presided over thousands of cases. None of them followed him home. This one would not be different. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the weight of his certainty, a truth was already settling in, slow and irreversible. A few careless seconds had passed in that room, a few words spoken lightly, a few smiles shared at the wrong time. They had felt insignificant. They were not, because some moments do not fade once the doors close. They wait. They echo. And before Judge Lawrence Sterling even realized it, the moment of mockery had already become the mistake no one could walk back. Judge Lawrence Sterling had always believed the law was a machine. You fed it facts. You followed procedure. You applied pressure in the right places. And it worked. At 55, Sterling had spent more than 3 decades inside that machine. Prosecutor, senior partner, judge. Each promotion came not from brilliance alone, but from discipline, from knowing when to speak, when to pause, when to smile, and when to remind people exactly who sat above them. That morning, everything was on schedule. His calendar was clean, his robe pressed, his name already whispered in the right offices downtown. A state-level appointment was no longer a fantasy. It was an expectation. People like him did not fall upward by accident. They earned it by proving, again and again, that they could keep the system running smoothly, efficiently, coldly, if necessary. The docket in courtroom 4B reflected that philosophy perfectly. Traffic violations, zoning disputes, minor property complaints that barely rose above paperwork. The kind of cases that clogged the system but did not matter. The kind assigned to judges who were trusted to clear them fast, without drama, without delay. Sterling glanced at the list and felt a familiar calm settle in. Nothing here could surprise him. The defendants were interchangeable, faces blurred together over the years. People who forgot permits, people who misunderstood regulations, people who believed their personal hardships should bend municipal code. They rarely did. Sterling believed fairness lived inside process, not empathy. If the rules were followed, justice was served. That was how he slept at night. That was how he justified every rushed hearing and every clipped interruption. As long as I am correct, the system will protect me. That thought had never failed him. Until Tobias King walked through the door. At first, Sterling barely registered him as an individual, just another body moving too slowly toward the defense table. Another delay. Another reason the clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. The man was tall, but age had folded him inward. His suit was outdated, gray fabric worn thin at the elbows, clean but tired, shoes polished carefully, as if effort mattered more than result. He leaned on a dark wooden cane that did not match anything else he wore. Sterling sighed inwardly. Great. Mr. King, he said, not bothering to hide the impatience, you are representing yourself today. Yes, sir, the man replied. The voice caught Sterling's attention for half a second. Low, steady, but thick with an accent that stretched vowels and softened consonants. It was the kind of voice Sterling had learned, unconsciously, to associate with confusion, with explanations that went nowhere, with hearings that took twice as long as they should. I come to speak for my building, the man continued, my home. Sterling's fingers tapped once against the bench. He told himself to be patient. He told himself this was exactly why procedure existed, to strip emotion away, to reduce stories to facts. The city alleges multiple zoning violations, Sterling said. Unsafe wiring, improper setback, unauthorized commercial use. How do you plead? The man hesitated. Papers rustled. His hands shook, just slightly. I am not guilty, he said carefully. The law says, in section. Sterling cut him off. I am not asking for a lecture, he snapped. Just the plea. A few people in the gallery shifted. The prosecutor, a young man named Gavin Reed, watched closely. Too closely. Sterling noticed it, but dismissed the feeling. Another defendant trying to sound smarter than he is, Sterling thought. Another waste of time. The man tried again, slower now, the accent heavier under pressure. There is a case, he said. Rivera. It explain. Sterling laughed. It came out sharper than he intended. A quick sound, dismissive, easy. You are trying to cite case law, he said. Sir, you can barely speak the language. The reaction was immediate. A ripple of amusement passed through the room. Not cruel, not loud, but real. Sterling felt it land exactly where he wanted. Authority reasserted, control restored. But not everyone laughed. Sterling missed that part. From the corner of his eye, he saw Martha the clerk stiffen. Her mouth opened, then closed. She glanced at the defendant again, longer this time. Something flickered across her face. Uncertainty. Doubt. The prosecutor leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Your Honor," Reed said carefully, "we could offer a continuance. Maybe let him get counsel." Sterling waved him off. "No need," he said. "This will be quick." Inside, something stirred. A faint instinct. A whisper that suggested this man was not reacting the way most did. No anger, no pleading, just patience. Sterling ignored it. Instinct was unreliable. Procedure was not. He straightened in his chair and delivered what he thought was a harmless smile. The kind meant to move things along. The kind he had used 1,000 times before. It landed wrong. But Sterling did not notice that either. He only saw the clock, only felt the familiar comfort of control, only believed with absolute certainty that nothing in this room had the power to touch him. And as he smiled, confident and assured, the illusion settled in completely. Everything was fine. Everything was exactly where it belonged. And Judge Lawrence Sterling had no idea that the smallest crack had already formed beneath his feet. The clock above the bench read 10:11 a.m. Judge Lawrence Sterling noticed it the way a pilot notices fuel levels, not with panic, but with calculation. Every minute mattered. Lunch with the governor's chief of staff was already penciled into his day like a signature waiting to be signed. This case should have been finished by now. Instead, it was dragging. Sterling leaned back in his chair and studied the man standing before him. Tobias King still hadn't sat down. He stood with both hands resting lightly on the defense table, his cane angled against the wood, his worn briefcase at his feet. He looked small from the bench. Smaller than Sterling expected. Not physically, socially. That was the difference Sterling trusted. Power, he believed, wasn't about volume. It was about framing, about deciding who mattered enough to be heard and who did not. And right now, this man was failing that test. "Mr. King," Sterling said, forcing politeness into his tone, "we have already established your plea. Unless you have licensed counsel present, I am not entertaining further commentary." Tobias nodded once. "I understand, Your Honor," he said. The accent was still there, thick, measured, every word chosen carefully, like someone stepping across ice. But there was no confusion in his eyes, no desperation. That unsettled Sterling more than he cared to admit. "Then we can proceed," Sterling replied. He glanced toward the clerk's desk. Martha met his eyes for half a second, then looked away. Her fingers paused above the keyboard. Sterling dismissed it. Clerks were sensitive. They always were. The prosecutor shifted in his seat. "Your Honor," Gavin Reed said again, quieter this time, "if the defendant would like time to consult an attorney, it may avoid appeal issues later." Appeal issues. The phrase irritated Sterling more than it should have. It implied oversight, doubt, that someone like him needed protecting from a man in a frayed suit. Sterling leaned forward. "Counsel," he said coolly, "this court is not obligated to babysit every individual who walks in here unprepared." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Sterling felt it, felt the attention sharpening. The room was no longer bored. It was awake. Tobias inhaled slowly. "Your Honor," he said, voice calm, "there is a precedent. It say the property is protected because it exists before the code." Sterling smiled, not broadly, not cruelly, just enough. "Sir," he said, tilting his head slightly, "you are struggling to make yourself understood. This is not a casual conversation. This is a court of law." A few people laughed. It was soft, nervous, the kind of laughter that sought approval. Sterling let it linger. The choice happened there, not in a shout, not in anger, but in permission. He could have stopped. He could have redirected. He could have allowed the man to finish his thought. The law would not have punished him for patience, but patience cost time, and time, Sterling believed, belonged to him. "So, here is what we are going to do," Sterling continued. "We are going to pause this proceeding until we find someone who can translate whatever it is you are attempting to say into proper legal English." Tobias stiffened slightly. "I speak English," he said, quiet, firm, more laughter, louder now. Sterling lifted his hand, silencing the room, then dropped it slowly. "I am sure you believe that," he replied. The words landed harder than he intended. Or maybe exactly as intended. Tobias did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not protest. He simply stood there, eyes steady, absorbing the moment like a man who had lived through worse. Sterling turned to the bailiff. "Call for an interpreter," he said. "We will not proceed until the defendant can communicate clearly." The bailiff hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom shifted again. The laughter died off, replaced by an uneasy stillness. Phones stayed in pockets, but hands hovered near them. People sensed it now. Something had crossed a line, even if they could not name it. Tobias lowered his gaze, not in shame, but in patience. The wait began. Minutes passed. 10, 15. Sterling checked his watch openly. No one missed the gesture. Tobias remained standing the entire time. He did not ask to sit. He did not lean on his cane. He simply waited. When the side door finally opened, no one spoke. The interpreter stepped inside, and somewhere in the back of the room, a small red light blinked on, unnoticed, capturing everything. A moment of mockery sealed into memory. A mistake no one would ever walk back. The interpreter entered quietly, as if she already sensed the weight in the room. Sarah O'Connell was not what most people expected. She was young, composed, dressed simply in a navy blazer with a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Her presence carried a different authority, one that did not demand attention, but earned it. She paused just inside the door, scanning the courtroom with a professional calm that bordered on detachment. Judge Sterling barely looked at her. "Good," he said. "We have a communication issue. Please determine what language the defendant is attempting to use." Sarah nodded and approached the defense table. For the first time since the hearing began, Tobias King moved. He did not step back. He did not sit. He only lifted his eyes to meet hers. For a brief second, the noise of the room seemed to drain away. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, then stopped. Something about the man unsettled her. Not the clothes, not the cane. It was his stillness, the way he held himself, the way his eyes did not wander or plead or shrink. They assessed. She took a breath. "Sir," she said gently, "what language would you like interpreted?" Tobias did not answer right away. Instead, he tapped his finger once against the worn leather of his briefcase. The sound was soft, rhythmic. Sarah froze. Her expression changed so subtly that most people missed it. Her brows drew together. Her lips parted slightly, as if she had just heard her own name spoken in a crowded room. She looked again, really looked, at his hands. The faint tremor, not of weakness, but restraint. At the simple iron ring on his finger. At the posture that did not belong to a confused defendant. Recognition struck her like ice water. She straightened slowly and turned toward the bench. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady but strained. "I don't believe an interpreter is necessary." Sterling finally looked up. His smile tightened. "Excuse me?" "This man's English is clear," she continued. "There is no language barrier preventing communication." A ripple moved through the gallery. Sterling felt irritation flare. "I am the one who decides what is clear in my courtroom," he said sharply. "If you cannot perform your role, Ms. O'Connell, I will find someone who can." Sarah swallowed. "This is not a misunderstanding," she said. "He understands you perfectly." "And yet I cannot understand him," Sterling replied, "which is precisely the problem." The words hung in the air. Tobias exhaled slowly. Then he did something unexpected. He released the cane. It clattered to the floor, loud and sudden, the sound echoing against the walls. A few people flinched. Sterling frowned. Tobias straightened. The stoop vanished. The careful slowness dissolved. He removed his glasses and placed them on the table with deliberate care. When he spoke again, the accent was gone. Completely. "Ms. O'Connell is correct, Judge Sterling," Tobias said. The voice that filled the room was calm, polished, unmistakably American, educated, commanding. It carried without effort, reaching the back row without the microphone. "I understand you," he continued, "and I understood you from the beginning." Silence crashed down. Sterling felt something cold settle in his stomach. Tobias lifted his gaze, meeting the judge's eyes directly now. "What you mistook for confusion was patience," he said. "What you dismissed as ignorance was restraint." Sarah stepped back, her hand pressed lightly against the table to steady herself. Sterling opened his mouth, then closed it. The room waited. I asked for an interpreter, Sterling said finally, forcing the words out. And I will proceed accordingly. Tobias nodded once. As you wish, he said. But you should know something before you do. Sterling felt the eyes of the gallery burning into him. The clerk had stopped typing. The prosecutor sat motionless. Tobias's gaze did not waver. This entire proceeding, he said, has been recorded, audio and video, in full. Sterling's jaw tightened. That is not permitted without court approval. It is, Tobias replied calmly, when the recording captures potential violations of due process. A faint buzz moved through the room. Sterling felt control slipping, not violently, not dramatically, just enough to notice. He forced a laugh. You expect this court to be intimidated by theatrics? No, Tobias said. I expect this court to be remembered. The words landed heavier than any objection. Sterling felt heat rise to his face. He told himself this was still manageable, still contained, still just a man talking above his station. He smiled again. It was the wrong smile. And in that moment, with cameras quietly rolling and witnesses unknowingly holding their breath, Judge Lawrence Sterling made the choice that would follow him far beyond this courtroom. Not because it was cruel, but because it was careless. And careless mistakes, once spoken aloud, never disappear. The change did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, slipping into the room the way cold does, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore. Judge Lawrence Sterling felt it before he understood it. The air in courtroom 4B no longer responded to him the way it always had. When he shifted in his chair, the room did not shift with him. When he cleared his throat, no one hurried to fill the silence. The authority that once snapped people into attention now seemed to hover, uncertain, waiting for permission. Eyes had changed. The gallery no longer looked at the bench with expectation. They looked sideways, at each other, at the defense table, at the interpreter, at Tobias King. Sterling noticed it and dismissed it as nerves. Shock, maybe. People were dramatic when routine cracked. It meant nothing. It would pass. He turned his attention back to the docket, tapping his pen once. Proceed, he said curtly. Tobias did not respond. Not because he was confused, because he was no longer speaking to Sterling at all. He turned slightly toward Sarah O'Connell instead. The movement was subtle, almost respectful, but its impact rippled through the room. He spoke to her calmly, his voice measured, clear, stripped of every trace of accent. Ms. O'Connell, he said, you may step aside if you wish. Your role here is complete. Sarah hesitated. Her heart was racing, but her mind was sharp now. Everything she had felt earlier was clicking into place. The cadence, the restraint, the confidence that did not beg for space because it assumed it already owned it. She nodded once and took a step back. Sterling stiffened. You will address the court, he snapped. Not the interpreter. Tobias looked at him then, not defiantly, not angrily, simply directly. For the record, Tobias said, I am addressing the record. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, trembling. Sterling felt heat rise again, the uncomfortable sensation of being watched rather than obeyed. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the bench. You are out of line, he said. This court will not tolerate grandstanding. A pause. Then Tobias smiled. It was not warm. It was not mocking. It was the kind of smile worn by someone who had already stepped 3 moves ahead and was waiting for the board to catch up. I apologize if my clarity is inconvenient, Tobias replied. I assure you, it will not last long. Whispers spread through the gallery, hushed but relentless. Sterling caught fragments. Did you hear his voice? That's not an accent. Who is he? Sarah stood frozen near the clerk's desk, her face pale. She knew now, not just who Tobias was, but what Sterling had done, what he had assumed, what he had allowed himself to enjoy. She looked at the judge, then away. That hurt more than the whispers. Sterling noticed the shift in his staff first. Martha no longer met his eyes. The bailiff stood straighter, as if unsure which authority he answered to. Even the prosecutor avoided looking up, his jaw clenched tight. The room had rebalanced itself, and Sterling was no longer at the center. Yet still, he told himself it was temporary. People loved drama. They loved the illusion of reversal, but systems corrected themselves. They always did. By tomorrow, this would be paperwork. By next week, a footnote. By next month, forgotten. He had followed procedure. He had stayed within the lines. He had done nothing that could not be explained away. Sterling straightened, reclaiming what confidence he could. "This hearing will continue," he said, "and once it does, we will return to facts." Tobias nodded. "Of course," he said. "Facts have a way of surviving." The tension thickened, invisible but suffocating. Sterling felt something slipping through his fingers now. Not control entirely. Not yet. Just enough to notice. And still, as the room held its breath, and the first true consequence settled quietly into place, Judge Lawrence Sterling believed the same thing he always had, that this moment would pass. That authority, once earned, could not be undone by a few strange minutes in a small courtroom. He did not yet see the edge, only the illusion that solid ground still lay beneath his feet. The truth did not arrive all at once. It leaked. A shaky video surfaced online that evening, filmed from the back row of courtroom 4B. The angle was imperfect, the audio uneven, but none of that mattered. What mattered was what it captured: a laugh, a pause, a man standing alone while the room reacted to him instead of listening. By midnight, it had been shared thousands of times. By morning, it had a headline. By noon, it had a narrative. Judge Lawrence Sterling watched it alone in his office, the door locked, the blinds half drawn. He had replayed the clip so many times that the sounds blurred together. His own voice sounded unfamiliar, thinner than he remembered. The smile on his face lingered too long, frozen now in digital permanence. It was already out of his hands. The press did not ask what he intended. They asked who he was. Local outlets ran the footage on a loop. National networks followed by the end of the day. Commentators slowed it down, replaying the moment frame by frame, dissecting the expression on his face, the reaction in the room, the sudden shift when Tobias spoke again without an accent. Social media did the rest. They called it arrogance. They called it prejudice. They called it everything Sterling had spent a lifetime insisting he was not. The Judicial Oversight Committee announced a preliminary review within 48 hours. His name quietly disappeared from the short list for the higher appointment he had spent years positioning himself for. No explanation, no courtesy call, just silence. Sterling told himself it was temporary. He reached out to people who had once returned his calls within minutes. Senior attorneys, former partners, a state senator who had toasted him at a fundraiser less than a month earlier. Voicemail, polite non-committal replies. "I can't comment right now. Let's talk later. This isn't a good time." Later never came. Inside the courthouse, doors closed more quickly when he approached. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Colleagues who once lingered in his doorway now found reasons to be elsewhere. His clerk requested a transfer. The prosecutor from that morning resigned and issued a statement distancing himself from Sterling's conduct. Sterling read it twice, then a third time. He felt something crack. At home, the damage was quieter but sharper. His wife did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She simply asked questions he could not answer. "Is that who you are? Do you talk to people like that? What happens now?" The children avoided him. The television stayed off. The house felt smaller every night. Judge Lawrence Sterling had always defined himself by his title. It was how strangers addressed him, how invitations arrived, how respect entered the room before he did. Now the title came with a pause, with a look, with a judgment he could not overrule. Meanwhile, Tobias King said nothing. He did not grant interviews. He did not issue statements. He declined invitations to comment and ignored requests for appearances. He returned to his office and resumed his work as if the courtroom had been a minor interruption rather than the center of a growing storm. From a distance, he watched. He watched the system react the way it always claimed it would. Committees convened, investigations opened, statements were released carefully, stripped of emotion and heavy with procedure. Tobias understood this phase well. The machine needed time to turn. Sterling, however, was running out of it. The review expanded. Financial disclosures were re-examined. Old rulings resurfaced. Patterns were questioned. What began as a moment of mockery became a lens through which his entire career was reinterpreted. Each headline stripped something away, not just authority, identity. He sat alone in his office one evening, the courthouse nearly empty, staring at the robe hanging behind the door. It looked heavier than it ever had, like a costume that no longer fit. This was no longer about one hearing. It was about who he had been allowed to become. And as the walls closed in, as the silence from former allies grew louder than any accusation, Judge Lawrence Sterling finally understood the truth he had been avoiding. The system he trusted was still working, just not for him anymore. The truth did not arrive with sirens or headlines. It arrived in a conference room with no windows, a long oak table, and a silence so disciplined it felt rehearsed. Judge Lawrence Sterling sat alone at one end, his hands folded, his robe absent for the first time in years. Across from him were 3 members of the Judicial Oversight Committee, faces neutral, voices calm. On the screen behind them was a single name, Tobias King. Sterling felt his jaw tighten. He had expected accusations. He had prepared defenses. What he had not prepared for was recognition. One of the committee members spoke. "Mr. King has declined to attend today," she said, "but he has submitted a statement. Before we read it, there are facts you should understand." The screen changed. Academic publications, law review articles, statutes annotated in margins Sterling recognized instantly. He had cited them dozens of times over his career, quoted them, leaned on them when rulings were thin and time was short. "Mr. King is a constitutional scholar," the man beside her continued. "He was one of the primary authors behind the zoning reform provisions you applied in Courtroom 4B. Sterling felt something cold move through him. "That's not possible," he said. "I would know." "You do," the woman replied. "You just never attached a face to the name." The screen shifted again. A black and white photograph appeared. A younger man stood beside a janitor's cart in the very courthouse Sterling now sat in. The janitor's uniform was worn, his posture tired, but his eyes were proud. "That is Elias King," the committee member said quietly. "Mr. King's father. He cleaned this building for 37 years. Sterling stared at the image. He remembered men like that. Not faces, roles, people who passed through hallways unnoticed unless they blocked the way. Judges mocked his accent. The man continued. Lawyers spoke over him. Security ignored him. He was invisible, except to his son. Sterling's throat tightened. The woman opened the statement and began to read. "My name is Tobias King. I did not enter Judge Sterling's courtroom to embarrass him. I entered to measure him." The words landed without drama, without malice. "I wanted to know whether the law I helped write protected people like my father, or whether it protected people like Judge Sterling." Sterling felt his hands curl into fists. "You see," the voice continued, steady and controlled, "the law is not neutral. It reflects the character of those entrusted to wield it. When applied with humility, it shields the vulnerable. When applied with arrogance, it becomes a weapon." The room remained silent. Sterling's mind raced backward through decades of rulings, through interruptions, through impatience disguised as efficiency, through moments he had justified because procedure allowed it. His mistake had not been legal, it had been human. The woman lowered the page. "Mr. King has chosen not to pursue personal retaliation," she said. "He has instead requested that this process continue without interference." Sterling looked up sharply. "He could end this," he said. "He could destroy me." "Yes," she replied. "He chose not to." The realization struck deeper than any accusation. Tobias King was not sparing him. He was leaving him alone with the system he had built, trusting it to do exactly what it was designed to do. Reflect its maker. Sterling leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling into his bones. For the first time since the video surfaced, he stopped thinking about survival and began thinking about truth. The law had not failed. He had. And as the meeting ended and the room emptied, Judge Lawrence Sterling understood something that would haunt him far longer than any sentence. Justice had not turned against him. It had simply stopped looking away. The day Judge Lawrence Sterling stopped being Your Honor, no one announced it. There was no gavel, no audience, no final speech. His name simply disappeared. The plaque outside his chambers was removed early in the morning before most staff arrived. By noon, his parking access was revoked. By evening, his courthouse badge no longer opened the doors it once commanded, without question. Sterling stood at the security checkpoint, holding a cardboard box with his belongings inside. Books, framed certificates, a fountain pen he had never actually used. The guard behind the scanner did not recognize him, or worse, chose not to. "Shoes off," the guard said flatly. Sterling hesitated. For decades, people had stepped aside when he approached. Today, he was the one holding up the line. He removed his shoes. The loss of the title came first. The loss of power followed quickly. The loss of voice came last. When the charges were read, no one leaned in to hear his defense. The room listened politely, the way one listens to a stranger on a bus. His arguments were noted, not respected. His words entered the record and went nowhere. Sterling tried to speak the way he always had. Calm, precise, correct. It no longer worked. The system he trusted responded to him the same way he had responded to thousands of others. Forms were returned for errors. Requests were delayed. Motions were acknowledged and ignored. He learned quickly how exhausting it was to be patient when patience was forced upon you. There was no violence, no shouting, no cruelty sharp enough to point at, just procedure. He was processed, fingerprinted, assigned a number. The robe was replaced with fabric that carried no authority. No one asked for his opinion. No one waited for his ruling. He was no longer important. Inside the facility, Sterling learned the language of waiting. Waiting for meals, waiting for access, waiting for someone to explain what should have been explained already. Men around him spoke quickly. In slang, he struggled to follow. Accents overlapped, words bent and shifted. When he asked them to repeat themselves, they laughed. Not loudly, casually. He felt the sting immediately. That laugh. It was the same sound he had dismissed as harmless. Sterling learned how long nights were when there was nothing to review but memory. How heavy silence felt when it had nowhere to go. He replayed moments he had never questioned before. The interruptions, the sighs, the way he had decided who mattered before they ever spoke. Now, no one asked him to speak at all. He filed requests the way others had once filed them before him, carefully, neatly, confident that correctness would be enough. They were denied. Wrong form. Incorrect filing window. Try again, later. Later became a habit. Sterling stopped correcting people when they mispronounced his name. He stopped explaining who he used to be. The words sounded strange even to him now. One evening, sitting on the edge of a narrow bunk, he caught his reflection in the metal surface of a locker. Older, smaller, unremarkable. A man he would have once hurried through a docket without a second thought. This was the price Tobias King had chosen. Not humiliation, not destruction, perspective. Sterling understood it then, fully and painfully. He had not been punished by vengeance. He had been placed inside the consequence of his own worldview. The law had not turned cruel, it had turned impartial. And, for the first time in his life, Lawrence Sterling had to live inside a system that did not care who he thought he was, only who he was now. The building at 42 Oak Street no longer looked like a place people avoided. Sunlight spilled through new windows where plywood once clung. The front door stood open most days, not as an invitation, but as a statement. Inside, the walls carried no portraits of powerful men, no marble floors meant to intimidate. There were worn chairs, children's drawings taped beside intake forms, and the low, constant murmur of voices finally being heard. The King Legal Aid Center opened quietly. No press conference, no ribbon cutting. Tobias King did not stand behind a podium. He stood at the front desk, sleeves rolled up, listening. That was how the work began, one conversation at a time. A tenant fighting eviction, a worker unpaid for months, an immigrant who spoke English slowly but understood injustice perfectly. The law was free here, not because it was cheap, but because dignity demanded it. Tobias watched young attorneys learn what schools never taught them, that intelligence did not announce itself with polished accents, that fear often sounded like hesitation, that respect was not earned by titles but by patience. He did not speak often about his father, but sometimes when the building grew quiet late in the evening, Tobias would pause in the hallway and picture Elias King pushing a janitor's cart through a courthouse that never learned his name. A man who spoke carefully, who was laughed at, who still believed the law mattered, even when it did not seem to notice him. This center was not revenge. It was correction. Across the city, Lawrence Sterling sat in a place where time moved differently. He was not redeemed. No ceremony erased what he had done. No apology restored what he had taken. His past did not soften simply because he finally understood it. But understanding came anyway. Late at night, in a quiet room with fluorescent lights and peeling paint, Sterling listened more than he spoke. Men around him talked about hearings they never understood, words they never had time to find. Sterling helped when he could, not as a judge, not as an authority, as a man. He learned what it felt like to wait without knowing the rules, to depend on someone else's patience, to hope that being heard might matter. Some lessons arrive too late to save a life as it once was, but they still arrive. The world moved on. The video faded from the news cycle. New scandals replaced old ones. Names rose and fell, but the echo remained, quietly shaping choices no headline ever captured, in courtrooms, in offices, in moments where laughter tempted someone to forget their power. Accent was never a measure of intelligence. Clothing was never proof of worth. And authority, unchecked, always revealed more about the person holding it than the system enforcing it. One careless moment had unraveled a career. One patient choice had built a legacy. Some mistakes don't fade. They become the echo you live inside for the rest of your life. The story did not end with applause or closure. It ended the way most real consequences do. Quietly, gradually, permanently. Years later, few people remembered the exact case number from Courtroom 4B. The headlines had long been replaced by newer outrages, newer villains, newer moments of public outrage. But the impact of that single morning never truly disappeared. It lived on in changed behavior, in pauses where there used to be impatience, in judges who chose to listen a few seconds longer, in lawyers who stopped underestimating the person standing in front of them. The King Legal Aid Center became a fixture of the city. Not famous, but trusted. People lined up before sunrise, clutching papers, hope, fear, and stories that had nowhere else to go. Inside, no one laughed at accents. No one rushed a sentence because it came out slowly. The law moved at the speed of understanding, not convenience. Tobias King never referred to what happened as victory. He understood that justice was not about defeating someone, but about correcting a direction. His legacy was not built on the fall of a judge, but on the rise of people who had been invisible for far too long. Every time a family stayed in their home, every time a worker received unpaid wages, every time someone was heard without being mocked, the echo softened. Lawrence Sterling lived with a different echo. In the quiet hours, stripped of title and audience, he replayed the moment he smiled when he should have listened. It followed him not as punishment, but as truth. He learned too late that authority without humility was not strength. It was blindness. And blindness always carries a cost. The law, he realized, had never been the problem. The mirror had. This was never just a courtroom story. It was a reminder. Power reveals, accents mislead, and the smallest choices made casually can shape entire lives. Some mistakes do not fade with time. They become the echo you live inside for the rest of your life.